contributions. So allow me to present to you Professor Jolyon Thomas, who is an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his PhD at Princeton University and is author already of 2 monographs, Drawing on Tradition, Manga, Anime, and Religion in Contemporary Japan from the University of Hawaii Press, and Faking Liberties, Religious Freedom in American Occupied Japan from the University of Chicago Press, published in 2019. He's currently completing a 3rd monograph entitled Difficult Subjects, Religion and the Politics of Public Schooling in Japan and the United States. He has written a wealth of articles, and I invite you to peruse his CV online, but most recently he co-authored together with Professors McLaughlin, Rotz, and Watanabe, Why Scholars of Religion Must Investigate the Corporate Form, which you can find in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. So we're very grateful for your willingness to guide this discussion. And now I pass this to you, Professor Thomas.
Dr. Laffin, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who are here. It's very strange in these situations to not be able to see the audience, but I can see the numbers of people here, and it's really exciting that we've got such a great turnout. So it's my pleasure to introduce our authors, but let me introduce the book very briefly. A pyramid scheme becomes a detective story. That detective story becomes a crime procedural. The crime procedural becomes fodder for the tabloid press, and the ensuing rumor and innuendo generate a moral panic. That moral panic becomes a ghost tale. These are just some of the thrilling twists and turns that readers can enjoy in the beautifully produced, lavishly illustrated, and skillfully translated new book, Christian Sorcerers on Trial. This book is utterly captivating. I read it cover to cover. I couldn't put it down. It features sympathetic characters. The narration is super engaging, and it has a wealth of insights about Edo period religion and society and jurisprudence. So it really is an honor for me to have a chance to discuss it with our authors. And what I'll do now is just introduce them very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to them to talk about the book in more detail. So I'll introduce the authors in order of surname, and I'm also going to introduce the one author who was not able to be with us today as well. So first of all, we have Dr. Fumiko Miyazaki. She received her BA and MA in Humanities from the University of Tokyo. After holding a position at the Historiographical Institute of the University of Tokyo, she taught Japanese history and Japanese religions in the Faculty of Humanities at Kaisen University from 1988 to 2014. From 2012 to 2017, she served as a member of the board of directors of the Nihon Rekishi Gakkai, that's the Society for Japanese Historical Studies. She is the author of many books and articles, far too many for me to list here. I'll just name a few of the most prominent ones and the ones that are related most directly to the book we're discussing today. Volume 4 of the Iwanami Koza Tenno to Oken o Kangaeru, or Thinking About the Emperor and Sovereignty. She did the volume Religion and Authority, Shurukyo to Ken'i. In addition, she contributed and edited the Rekishi ni okeru shuen to kyosei, that could be maybe borders and coexistence, josei kegare eisei. And also co-authored with Hayashi Makoto and Ohashi Yukihiro and others, Tasha Tokyokai, which was volume 6 of the Shirizu Nihonjin to Shukyo. So that's Others and Borders, or Others and Boundaries. Our next author is Kate Wildman Nakai. She is Professor Emerita of Sophia University. She received her BA and MA in Asian languages from Stanford University and her PhD in East Asian languages and civilizations from Harvard University. After holding positions at Harvard and the University of Oregon, she taught Japanese history in the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Sophia University from 1980 to 2010. From 1997 to 2010, she also served as editor of Monumenta Nipponica, and we're all extremely indebted to her for her work in that very important venture. In 2002, she received the Watsuji Tetsuro Cultural Prize for the Japanese translation of Shogunal Politics, Arai Hakuseki, and the Premises of Tokugawa Rule. In addition to that book, she has also published Women of the Mito Domain, Recollections of Samurai Family Life, And then we also have the Japanese translation I mentioned before, Arai Hakuseki no Seiji Senryaku Jugaku to Shiron. And then the book that we have today, or excuse me, before the book we have today, also another translation, Lust, Commerce, and Corruption, an account of what I have seen and heard by an Edo samurai, which I forgot to mention, she had also done in collaboration with Miyazaki sensei. I apologize for the oversight. Both of our authors collaborated on that as well with our third author who can't be with us today due to an insurmountable time zone difference, Mark Teeuwen, who is a professor at Oslo University. He studied Japanese language and culture at Leiden University and completed his PhD there in 1996. He's held the position of professor of Japanese studies at Oslo University since 1999. His research deals with the history of Japanese religion with a focus on Shinto. Among his recent publications are A New History of Shinto and A Social History of the Ise Shrines, both co-authored with John Breen of Nichibunken. And most recently, aside from this book, Sacred Heritage, UNESCO and the Changing Shapes of Japanese Religion. That book came out this year, co-edited with Aika P. Rotz, also of the University of Oslo. These authors have been very generous in sharing their time with us, and they have given us a great gift in the form of this wonderful translation. So what I'd like to do now is to turn it over to the two authors who are here to provide some brief opening remarks about the book.
Thank you very much, Jolyon, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you so much for picking up the role of facilitator on short notice, reading the book, and thanks especially to Christina, Laffin, and her helpers for arranging this wonderful event. We're very sorry that, as Jolyon mentioned, that the third member of our authorial team, Mark Teeuwen, can't be with us in person today, but he has sent a message for us to relay, and I will, after some brief initial remarks, I will pass on his message. So Jolyon gave a much more spectacular introduction to the volume than I could do, but let me just fill in a few further details about it. So the book includes translations of several different kinds of sources about an incident that occurred in Osaka and Kyoto in 1827, in which a group of people were investigated and eventually executed for being Christians, or Christian, as they were referred to. And we too prefer to use the term Christian because it serves to bracket the ideas that people in Japan at the time had about Christianity, and to demarcate their image of Christianity from more general conventional understandings of it today. So the 1827 incident was an extraordinary event. Christianity, as you know, had been strictly proscribed in Japan since the early 17th century. And no one had been investigated or punished as a Christian for well over 100 years. We might note that this incident too did not start out as an investigation of Christian. The first person to come to the attention of the authorities, a woman named Sano, as Jolyon indicated, had been running a kind of Ponzi scheme in which she promised to increase her client's wealth. The investigation by the Osaka magistrate started with the officials looking into that. To her clients, Sano was an inari medium, someone who foretold the future or performed healing rites by receiving communications from the inari deity, a popular Buddha Shinto deity who had many devotees among the populace. But as the officials looked into Sano's activities, they found that she was performing some unusual rites, and after several months of investigation, they wrested from her a confession that she was in fact a devotee of the Christian, Lord of Heaven. It was her devotions to this deity, she confessed, that were the real source of her powers as a medium. This astounding discovery then led the officials on a wide-ranging investigation to track down Sano's fellows and also their relatives and acquaintances. Eventually, the magistrate arrested and interrogated a large number of people, a small group of main figures who had actually worshipped the Lord of Heaven, and a much larger number of people who had not worshipped, but who were connected to the main parties in some way. Signed confessions were central to the Tokugawa system of criminal jurisprudence. These confessions took the form of detailed testimonies by the main parties in which they reviewed the course of their lives and described their activities as Christian. For the secondary parties, the confessions are usually shorter statements in which they describe their relationship to the main figures and try to establish that they did not have any idea of what was being done by those main figures. The investigating officials would also interpolate into the testimonies comments about how they had tried to corroborate one point or another. These testimonies then became the basis for review of the case at higher levels of government and for making decisions about the appropriate punishments to mete out. So part one of the book consists of translations of the dossier of multiple testimonies that was submitted for review at higher governmental levels. Part two translates records of the deliberations within the shogunal government over how to deal with this, quote, unprecedented case. The fact that it was unprecedented, that there were no established guidelines to follow in deciding on punishments for Christian, posed a major challenge to the officials. This was because by the latter half of the Tokugawa period, judicial officials had come to see it as crucial to align punishments with established earlier precedents. And then part three translates records of rumors about the incident that circulated in its wake and later retellings of the story. Now we can ask whether the Christian who figured in this incident can really be called Christian. They seem to have had no connection with the underground Christians who we know today continued to exist in Kyushu throughout the Tokugawa period. They traced their origins to a shadowy figure named Mizuno Gunki, who had died before his followers came to light and thus could not be interrogated directly. Gunki had access to writings about Christianity in Chinese by Matteo Ricci, and he talked about these writings to some of his followers. But he also drew from the popular anti-Christian literature that depicted Christian as sorcerers. Strikingly, however, he and his followers turned the association of Christian with sorcery around. For them, it was a kind of wellspring of mysterious power to tap into. And a good bit of the actual content of their Christian practice, such as the performance of water austerities to gain an unwavering mind, drew from practices that were widespread among popular religionists. One final point that I'd like to mention is that the chief investigator of the incident was Oshio Heihachiro, who at the time was a senior staff official in the Osaka magistracy. In 1830, after the case had been concluded and punishments meted out, He resigned and devoted himself to his private Confucian academy. And then, 7 years later, he raised a manifesto against the government, accusing it of callousness towards the populace, which was suffering from a severe famine, and mounted an armed attack on the Osaka magistracy, where he had served, that left much of Osaka in flames. Oshio counted his investigation and prosecution of the Christian as one of his 3 main accomplishments as an official. We cannot identify his direct voice in the materials that are translated in the volume, but his presence hovers over them. How to reconcile the picture that emerges from these records with the image of Oshio as a principled defender of the poor and downtrodden remains an ongoing question. And now let me relay Mark Teeuwen's message. After noting that this is what he would like to talk about if he could be with us in person, he goes on to write, "My penny's worth would be about the possibilities to use this book for teaching. I am teaching a course on pre-modern Japanese history where I try to make the students read and interpret primary sources. They learn to think about such things as the author's intentions in writing the text, the intended audience, the source's biases and overall reliability, the constrictions of genre, epistemology, or worldviews reflected in the source, etc., etc. I find that Christian Sorcerers on Trial is perfect material for this. The tale is exciting and the circumstances are particular. Testimonies wrung out of people by force, an investigator come author with a well-documented ideological position, a genre with strict rules, and a lot of back and forth in reaction to the original text or to the incident itself. All these things give students and teachers so much to talk about that you could easily spend multiple classes on this text alone." And to that sentiment, Fumiko and I would heartily agree. So let me now pass the mic or the screen to Fumiko.
Thank you, Kate. And I would like to express thanks to Christina Laffin for organizing this great event. And I also thankful to Jolyon Thomas for acting as a facilitator of our discussion. And thank you everybody for participating in this event with us. Now, yes, I'd like to say give a brief presentation about what I'm impressed by this incident. One of the striking features of the incident that we take up in the book is the prominent role played in it by women. It is quite exceptional in this regard. People in early modern Japan generally assumed that women were weak and passive by nature. The officials responsible for handling judicial cases usually operate on the same assumption. They tended to view a female wrongdoer as an accomplice rather than the main figure. And they tended to deal with a female criminal more leniently than a male who committed the same crime. By contrast, in this case, the officials saw the 3 women they investigated as main parties to the incident, as being equally guilty to the 3 main male figures. Indeed, both official documents and popular accounts about incident tend to depict the women as being more culpable and more dangerous than their male counterparts. Officials interrogated the women for months, examined if their statements were true or false, and composed long and detailed testimonies from them. These testimonies are much longer than the testimonies of the male principals and contain more details about the activities of the person testifying. Popular accounts also recorded more information both reliable and not, about the women than they did about the men. The materials which we translated in the volume vividly depict the life of the female principals who earn their living as mediums in the outskirts of the large cities of Kyoto and Osaka. For example, we learn from the testimony of Toyoda Mitsugi, the ringleader of the three women, that she migrated from a rural area to Kyoto as a child with her parents. She began working as a housemaid in her early teens, became a prostitute in her 20s, and married a man whom she met in the pleasure quarters. The man was the son of a Shinto priest, and the two of them began to make a living as mediums and diviners. However, some years later, the man became infatuated with another woman and abandoned Mitsugi, leaving her consumed with rage and jealousy. Mitsugi's testimony goes on to tell us that she decided to make a living by performing divination and healing rituals rather than to remarry or depend on a man. She thereupon became the follower of a man who impressed her with the performance of sorcery. Following his directions, Mitsugi began to engage in ascetic training and was initiated by him into the creed of the Lord of Heaven and its secret methods. She believed that devotion to the Lord of Heaven enabled her to obtain mysterious powers, which she used to perform miraculous things and win success as a medium. Unlike the main male parties to the incident, who in the course of the investigation expressed regret about their affiliation with a prohibited cult, Mitsugi remained unrepentant to the end. She continued to take pride in her unwavering mind until she died on the cross. Writings from the same period, most of which were authored by male intellectuals, rarely refer to the life of women belonging to the urban underclass. By contrast, one of the most valuable aspects of the record that we have translated in this volume is the vivid picture they provide of the daily life and religious practices of women engaging in miscellaneous and unstable occupations on the margins of urban society. We hope that many people will become caught up, as we did, the story of Mitsugi and her fellows. And I hope that people will find in these materials new insight into life as lived in the early 19th century Japan. Well, now let me pass it to Jolyon.
Thank you very much, both of you, Professors Miyazaki and Nakai, for those wonderful remarks. And also, if you can hear it later when this is existing in the form of a recording, thank you as well to Mark Teeuwen. We have a lot to work with already. There's everything that you've said so far about this project is so rich. I thought that I'd take a few minutes to ask a few focused conversations while the audience develops their own questions. We can have a conversation, and for the members of the audience, if you have questions for the panelists, please just put them in the chat or in the Q&A function. So the two of you have told us quite a bit about the narrative that the book transmits. And as I said before, this is absolutely gripping material, really a page turner. But I was wondering if you could take a couple of minutes to tell us about the primary sources that you drew on. And for some people, that may mean the material texts. It may mean which edition, if there were multiple versions of those texts, where they were found. And I'm also curious about what attracted you to these texts in the first place. And so if you could just talk about those sorts of things about the primary sources themselves, that would be great.
Thank you, Jolyon, for raising a very good question and very well. I'm happy to respond to it. So we drew on 3 kinds of primary sources for the book. First, we took up two manuscript copies of the basic dossier of the document concerning the investigation and judgment of the case, together with some additional judicial records. The second kind are the, second item is the information about the incident gathered by 2 people living at the time who are known for compiling massive collections of news about events of the day. One of these authors was based in Osaka, and the other was living in Edo. And the third kind is the excerpts from a popular account of the life of Oshio Heihachiro, the official who investigated the case. The account describes both his great deeds and his unsuccessful attempt at rebellion, and suggests that the rebellion may be linked in some way to his involvement with Toyoda Mitsugi. Among these sources of information, the 2 manuscript copies of the basic document concerning the case, which I listed up as the first one, make up the core of the volume. One of these copies was made after the case was concluded. It contains the most extensive information about the deliberation over the case at the higher levels of the shogun government. It has been known to Japanese researchers since early 20th century, when the scholar Koda Shigetomo, who had acquired it, referred to it in his biography of Oshio Heihachiro. I came across a facsimile copy of this manuscript in the stacks of Historiographical Institute of the University of Tokyo, or Todai Shiryo Hensanjo, about 35 years ago, or maybe 40 years, when I was working there. Reading the testimonies of the people investigated, I was fascinated by the wealth of information about the lives of both male and female perpetrators and their associates. These people were living in the margins of urban society of the early 19th century. In this regard, these records show a clear contrast with most texts from this period. Contemporary texts rarely refer to the life of people who belonged to the urban underclass and engaged in various miscellaneous occupations. The contemporary text only criticized these people for not engaging productive occupations. They were often called idlers. Still fewer contemporary texts pay attention to lowly women. Lowly women were overlooked as if they didn't exist. By contrast, as I mentioned earlier, the testimonies provide more abundant information about the life history and religious practices of the 3 female principals, 3 women, than they do about the 3 male counterparts. While we are working on translating the manuscript copy, once owned by Koda Shigetomo, we found another copy of the testimonies held by the law faculty of the University of Tokyo. We discovered that this is a copy of the dossier privately kept by the Osaka governor, who oversaw the transmission of the dossier between Osaka and Edo officials in the initial stage of the deliberation over the incident. In contrast to Koda's copy of the dossier, this one was made as soon as the governor received the dossier from the magistrate in charge of the investigation. Therefore, it shows what the original dossier was like. Although it has not attracted the attention of the researchers until now, and contains less information than the Coda manuscript about the judicial deliberation of Edo officials in particular. It has, well, this newly found documents had a great merit of its own. By comparing it with the Coda manuscript, we can see concretely how, in the course of the deliberations in Edo, it was decided to alter the record of the testimonies so as to remove something that high shogun officials found inconvenient. It's quite remarkable to find such clear evidence of the deliberate alternation of official document. For the translation, we thus made a transcription that collate the two manuscripts, and readers can see clearly what was removed, what was taken out from the original version, and think about the various implications of those changes. Now, I think although it is not adequate, I explained about the source materials. Now, so let me give back to the Jolyon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very rich. And I'll just say, because I really would like to talk about teaching here, that last part that Miyazaki sensei you mentioned is wonderful, because one of the things that I find in the classroom that I'm often trying to do is get students to pay attention to evidence of redaction or editing and that sort of thing. So this is a wonderful source where they can see it happening in real time, so to speak. And on that note, as I read this book, I've already mentioned this, but I feel so strongly about it. This is a really gripping narrative. It is literally a page turner. And one of the things that was most striking as somebody who studies law is that even the boring, dry legal stuff was not boring or dry at all. It was, I mean, if you're used to reading case law and stuff like that, it puts you to sleep instantly, but not in the case of this book. And that's a testament to the power of the translation. And as well as to the richness of the sources, as Miyazaki sensei was just mentioning to us. So with those sorts of things in mind, I was wondering if you could narrate for us the sort of process that you used for the translation and the writing. I'm interested in how the three of you broke up the material, the sort of division of labor amongst you, but also, like, were there terms or concepts that you found difficult to translate? And I think there have been some hints about this already, any challenges that you encountered when it came to translating the narrative voice?
Thank you. I'll take this question. So as Fumiko just described, she made a typed transcript of the manuscript copies, a collated version of the testimonies and the judicial deliberations. And this makes up about 3/4 of the volume. And Mark and I then divided up the transcript and the other materials included in the book, which are translations of published sources. And we made initial draft translations. And then we all three went over and revised and discussed these drafts multiple times, catching errors and inconsistencies, adjusting sometimes back and forth several times, how we rendered particular terms, especially ones that appeared in multiple places across the materials. And you mentioned the issue of narrative voice, which was a big challenge. In fact, I think the original documents are not as dry as case law. And the testimonies are couched in a style that has momentum and I think a strong oral quality, although it's a written, obviously a written source. And the style falls somewhere between what would be direct and indirect voice in English. So we started out doing everything in indirect voice, but that resulted in a quite turgid rendering that didn't convey the immediacy and the flow of the original. And it also made worse the problem that the testimonies contain a plethora of personal names. There are many quotes within quotes, so we ended up with a lot of instances along the lines of Mitsugi said that, Gunki said that. So at a certain point, Mark said, why don't we try this in first person mode? And so we did, and it greatly improved the pace. It reduced the problem with having so many names. And I think it's much closer to the tone of the original. As far as terms go, we made a distinction between the terms that appear in a legal context or set phrase, which we felt was important to be consistent across the whole document, so readers could see what the connotations are as they appear repeatedly. So we worked, again, with a lot of trial and error to find what would be the best English equivalents. But then there are other terms of a more qualitative nature that we also initially tried, or at one point we tried to be consistent in that, but that just ended up very awkward and not able to convey the meaning. So an example is fushigi, which appears a lot in the materials. And sometimes it means miraculous, sometimes mysterious, sometimes strange. So we ended up ultimately with not trying to use the same translation, but to establish a kind of range of equivalents and use those. So that's essentially our strategy.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And we've already got some questions coming in. I'm going to hold them for just a second and ask one or two more of my own and give people a chance to gather their thoughts. But if you've put a question in the Q&A, I guarantee we'll get to those. So one thing I think may be a little bit counterintuitive for people who are just seeing the title of the book is two words that you put right next to each other, which is Christian Sorcerers. So I think that if I were to say this to my students, they would say, Christian Sorcerers, what's that? Oh, sounds cool. But they would also maybe find it a little bit counterintuitive. So for those people who may be watching who are a little bit unfamiliar with this period and Edo period governance and so forth, I was wondering if you could explain the sort of official religions policy of the Tokugawa shogunate, why there was this ban on Christian rituals and teachings, and then also how people understood the Kirishitan in relation to other sort of sects, Buddhist sects and ritual practices. And you know, the word sorcery is one word, but I think we might also be able to tie this to words that have come up in other works on religion in this period, categories like heresy and magic, science even. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about the overall worldview about the Kirishitan and how that fits into religions policy in the period and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Jolyon. Well, it's a very good question. And well, I think I can manage the, well, mainly that, well, the Tokugawa government policy vis-a-vis the religion, including Kirishitan and the other miscellaneous popular religions. And as for the reasons for the prohibition of Christianity, we can point out that initially government leaders feared the connection between Christian missionaries or Catholic missionaries and the political and military ambitions of Western countries. The Japanese political leaders also feared that Christianity could function as a spiritual support for rebellion against the political ruler. And it is based on their experience the experience of Shimabara Amakusa Rebellion, which occurred in 1637 and 1638, consolidated this negative image. This uprising was carried out by an alliance of peasants and warriors who rallied around Christian leaders, and the rebels made use of Christian insignia, such as flags carrying a picture of angels and Holy Grail. The government was shocked that the rebels could hold out so long against the fierce attacks by large military forces sent by the shogunate to suppress the uprising. The story grew that the rebels must have been supported by powers of sorcery, and so the idea that Christians were rebels and at the same time masters of sorcery took root both in the minds of power holders and in popular culture. This became dominant image of Christians throughout the Tokugawa period. The political elite feared that Christians would bewitch ordinary people and encourage them to engage in unlawful things, and that this would lead to unrest and disorder. The shogunate also looked suspiciously on other marginal religious practitioners, and it was particularly worried about ordinary lay people invading in the religious functions that were supposed to be reserved for authorized professional Buddhist and Shinto clergy. In some ways, what Mitsugi and her fellows engaged in was not so different from the activity of such miscellaneous popular practitioners. But because of the image that Christians were dangerous sorcerers, the authorities saw Mitsugi and her fellows as posing a much more serious threat than ordinary popular religionists. The officials thus decided that to set a warning example, they should mete out much more severe punishment to Mitsugi and her fellows than they would have to ordinary popular religionists engaging in various irregular practices. So, and as for the other aspects of the question, I hope that we can deal with it in the later part of the discussion. Thank you.
I could say something about the other terms, or should we go ahead and address other questions?
I think based on what I'm seeing from the other questions, it might be valuable to address those other terms just briefly, if you don't mind, and then I'll turn to the other thing.
Sure. Heresy, like heterodoxy or orthodoxy, seems to me to be a very tricky concept to apply to the Tokugawa context. So the Tokugawa strategy was to keep religious life under control, keep it within safe bounds by sanctioning multiple Buddhist sects and other religious groups, and to use these as kind of segmented, separate channels that would be self-policing. So Tokugawa authorities did not, to my mind, attempt to oppose any uniform orthodoxy. And thus, there's also not the idea of a heresy that is universal. Rather, orthodoxy and heresy are concepts that are applicable within those channels, those separate channels. One Buddhist sect for what is orthodox or heretical for one Buddhist sect is not going to be for another. So if you try to look at what is found problematic about these people by using a concept such as heresy, I think it will lead to assumptions, or will bring with it assumptions about a quite different religious framework than was the case in the Tokugawa period. the magic, Mark in particular felt that magic was too loaded a concept. And so we avoided that. And that's why we framed it essentially within sorcery, bewitching, dark arts, things like that. But I would think that that would certainly be a possible concept to work with. Ideas about charlatanry, I think that would certainly be something that's a concept that officials would have recognized. I mean, the principals didn't think that's what they were, but I would think that a comparative analysis in terms of charlatanry would work. So that.
Excellent. And thank you both so much for your responses. And I should also say that you know, I'm coming at this from the perspective of a scholar of religion who is interested in sort of how those categories get defined, sometimes applied accurately or inaccurately to time periods where they may not have existed. And so I've been thinking along with people like Jason Josephson or Yijiang Zhang, who have used words like science or heresy in describing this period. And so I think that there's a lot that we could get out of juxtaposing this wonderful translation with these other books that are dealing with the same time period. I'm going to move into some of the questions we've received from the audience. And I just want to say that along the way, I'm going to sort of insist that we continue to talk about the issue of teaching, because I think that this is a wonderful sort of resource for teaching students at all levels and with all sorts of backgrounds. So on that note, we talked a bit about the sort of governance of religion, for lack of a better term, in this period. But I think there's one question that is a burning one for many people, which is why crucify these people? Why were they crucified? Why not just execute them? And for the person who asked the question, then I guess the question is, well, what counts as a good execution? But you know, so you know, this may be a simple 1 or 2 sentence answer, but why crucifixion? Why such a drastic way of punishing these people?
Okay, I will. Fumiko and I actually sort of talked about this question yesterday, and there's a kind of image sometimes that crucifixion is in line with their character as Christian. You know, they're familiar from the early images of the persecutions at the beginning of the 17th century, end of 16th, beginning of 17th, like the 26 martyrs all arrayed on crosses. But many of the executions that occurred early in the Tokugawa period of Christian weren't crucifixions. They were burned at the stake or simply beheaded and things like that. But crucifixion, which in the Japanese case involves tying the person to the cross and then stabbing them with spears, they're not left to die on the cross in the Western manner, was seen as one of the most severe death penalties. There are various forms of death penalty in the Tokugawa period, and they're graded to what are seen levels of different crimes. And crucifixion is the most serious, one of the most serious. So once it's decided that these people are Christian, then everybody sort of agrees that they warrant the most severe form of punishment. But in order to come to rationalize that decision, the authorities go what might seem to us to be a kind of roundabout way. among the various crimes for which crucifixion was specified in the code of kind of judicial procedures that dates to the middle of the 18th century, and which was the defining framework for criminal jurisprudence. For instance, crucifixion was also used for people who murdered their parent or their master. So a kind of direct challenge to higher authority. But when they're deliberating this case, the officials in Edo don't refer to that as a relevant precedent or example. They instead note that crucifixion was also the punishment for people who bypassed one of the barriers that you were supposed to go through. And this seems a kind of strange analogy at first thought, but I think their rationale was that both the prohibition of Christianity and the prohibition about going through the barriers was something that was widely known. It was posted on these placards, which were erected throughout Japan. So it was a fundamental law that had been broken. So essentially that's the reason why they end up crucifying them.
Thank you so much for that very thorough answer. I'm going to combine two of the questions that I've received because I think they're sort of two sides of the same coin. So one of the questions says, and I think we've covered some of this already, but maybe this is an opportunity for digging a little bit deeper. One of them is saying this incident happened during the Tempo era, when there were severe crackdowns on heterodox practices. Now, we've learned from Professor Nakai that heterodox may be a problematic term, but I think we all know that we're talking about things that are sort of forbidden or whatever. So this person is asking us to talk about the larger judicial or religious policy context. And then we have another question, which is sort of inverting this and looking for similarities with other groups. So are there overlaps between the language of sorcery or magic, either within this group or attributed to this group, and the language of groups like the person has put Nyorai Kyo and other popular movements of the time. So I think we can see this as what's the broader sort of policy about movements that are forbidden? We've largely covered that, but then also what similarities and differences do we see with other popular movements?
Let me just briefly say something, and I'll turn over to Fumiko to talk about parallels with something like Nyorai. But generally, in Tokugawa jurisprudence, irregular religious activities that are dealt with as criminal activities, the most severe punishment was exile to a remote island. So the death penalty was not, in terms of precedent, enacted for such heterodox activities, unless there were some kind of other aggravating circumstances. So this case is kind of a different, put on a different level. But in terms of the activities, you know, what these people are actually doing is quite, you can find lots of examples, apart from the worship of the Lord of Heaven, you can find lots of other parallels. Fumiko, do you want to say something about comparison with the Nyorai Kyo?
Right, yeah. Well, thank you. Well, it is a very, good question. Well, it is true that from the late 18th century, many are new religious religions. So later they were called new religions, but Nyorai Kyo or Kurozumi Kyo, and a little later, Tenri Kyo and Konko Kyo, as well as a cult of Mount Fuji, became quite popular among people. And the back's policy vis-a-vis these are, new and unauthorized religious groups was, I think that it depending on cases. When these groups are small and did not attract the attention of many people, the Bakufu simply overlooked it. well, just like the other more, what should I say, strange customs found in Japanese folklore. However, when they become more, what should I say, in Baku's term, rampant, and attracted attention of more people, then the Baku tried to limit their activities. However, the Baku did not punish them as being belonging to the evil cult. So the Baku regarded that it's a kind of a transgression of the rule that ordinary people should observe. So they should not invade into the area which is reserved for the professional religious figures like the monks or Shinto priests. So the Baku stopped them, but rarely these people, the practitioners of popular religions, are punished. Well, when Baku punished them, the Baku had to find a proper reason. For instance, they gave something strange to the sick people or something like, or received money from them, and kind of a fraud. And so, so Baku, what should I say? Well, used both strong, well, something strong and something soft vis-a-vis the, well, depending on the case. And however, I think that after this incident, after this, the Keihan Christian incident, Baku officials in charge of the investigations of these popular religionists came to think, if they are not Christians, or if they, or is there anything similar to the Mitsugi's group? And probably this is the impact of this incident over the judicial procedures of the Baku vis-a-vis unauthorized religious groups. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you both for the very thorough answers. We have some questions about the sources and the geographic context, which I'm going to sort of set aside for a moment because we've had a set of questions that are all sort of grouped together, and I'm going to present them to you as a set, and you can address them sort of as you'd like. Let's put this in terms of, sort of what concretely are the so-called Christian practices. And again, I think as we say the word Christian, we need to sort of put Christian/Kirishitan. One person is wanting to know about like what concretely these people were accused of doing. And then I think maybe one person who is somewhat familiar with the Fumie practice is asking if the accused were ordered or forced to perform acts in order for the accusers to judge guilt. And a related question is about torture. So many people, especially if they've read Danny Botsman's book or others, may be familiar with the prevalence of torture in judicial settings during this period. So then how do we sort of disentangle the representations that appear in the official record from the positions of the people who are being tortured and having confessions extracted from them? And a final thing that's related to this sort of constellation of questions is, did the Catholic Church know about this? Is there some sort of way for other religious authorities outside of Japan to have known of this and to condemn this? I think this is a sort of geopolitical question of like how authorities external to Japan may have responded to this had they known. So that's a lot of stuff, and feel free to take what you would like out of there.
Yes, and I may ask to have some repeated. Just the last one is most easily dealt with. I don't think there was any possible way for the church to know anything about this. So, but it does kind of, the story of it, I think this image of Christian as sorcerers and dangerous, the fact that it is really regenerated at the end of the Edo period certainly must have also influenced then the response to the return of the missionaries and things like that after Perry comes. Let me pick up on the Fumiya question, because I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects of this this case. In terms of the Christian practices, which then maybe I'll ask Fumiko to elaborate on after the Fumiya, one of the things was that Mizuno Gunki had an image, which presumably was of Mary holding Jesus. And he used that as a kind of initiation rite where his followers would drip blood on the breast of this image. Sano was not a direct, she's a kind of disciple of a disciple of a disciple. And she didn't, this image was not used in her initiation. And so the person who initiated her, another woman, told her that the Lord of Heaven was a deity without shape or form. And unfortunately, the officials don't elaborate, don't follow up that question, what was the idea of this Lord of Heaven? But anyway, Sano had heard that in Nagasaki, they performed Fumiya annually. It had become a kind of yearly ritual, sort of the beginning of the year people would. And she knew this, which is interesting because Fumiya wasn't performed elsewhere in Japan on any routine basis. It was also elsewhere in Kyushu, but not where she was. And she thinks that if she goes to Nagasaki and performs Fumiya, that she will be able to see that the Lord of Heaven must have shape and form because it's in this kind of icon, and she will be able to see it. So she takes herself off to Nagasaki, stays in an inn and performs Fumiya at the beginning of the year, and is further confirmed in her faith, and her powers as a medium are increased. So this is in the testimony, the original version of the testimony that went up to Edo. And this appalls the officials because the whole premise of Fumiya is that the believer will tremble, he or she will show that, so you'll be able to see that they are Christian. And in Nagasaki by this time it had become routine, so I don't think people were really paying that much attention to whether people were trembling. But anyway, the premise was this was a way you could identify Christian. And what Sano did just sort of upends the premises of that whole structure. So that is the part that they wanted taken out of the testimony. They deal with this problem by saying it didn't happen. There's only Sano's word to say that this happened. And so we will just delete all references to the Fumiya from the testimony. So it gives us another picture of Fumiya in the Edo context. So Fumiko, would you like to say a little bit more about what were the specific practices that the people were doing that are Christian? What is the content of their quote, Christian?
Pardon? Yes.
What was the content of their Christian practices of the people? What do they do?
Yes, well, actually, there's a combination of the popular image of the Christian as sorcerers, and but exactly what Mitsugi and the other people do was, and they made a small doll in the paper with a piece of paper, and when they practice a healing ritual, so they put a nail to the part of the paper doll, of a certain part of the paper doll that the patient has problems, and they poured water from midnight to about 1 or 2 o'clock, and continually they chant the incantation the name of the Jesus, Paradise, and Virgin Mary in her hand. That is a practice, and the practice is very, very similar to what was conducted by another kind of female medium called Azusa Miko. And the other practices are just the water austerity. They stand under the waterfall, and so it strengthened their unwavering mind. At the same time, they could get an inspiration. Probably they obtain the power to receive the inspiration given by the Lord of Heaven or other kinds of protecting spirits. Okay, well, please read the book for further details.
And I'll just say the book is, if you're curious about these questions about what they were actually doing, the book is very, very rich. This primary source is unparalleled, really. So I'm conscious of people's time. I'm going to maybe just ask one more question on behalf of the people who are here. And for those whose questions haven't been answered yet, I apologize. But this is a question about geography. Somebody has asked, beyond the fact that Oshio Heihachiro ended up being involved, is it significant that this took place in Osaka and Kyoto? Could the same sort of thing have happened in Edo? And would things have played out differently? So it's a bit counterfactual, but I think it's still asking us to sort of think about the specifics of, Kansai versus Kanto and the different governance structures that were in place there.
Oh, that's a very good question. Oshio, it's really hard to see exactly. We can't see his voice saying directly what he thinks it is. It's indirectly reflected. But I think that probably Oshio had this kind of charge ahead, follow my own ideas approach, which was very different from what the general run of Tokugawa officials did. And in fact, when the case reaches Edo, the first reaction of the members of the deliberative council, the Hyojosho, was to question whether these people were really Christians. They say, if it's a matter of startling people by doing strange things, there's lots of groups that try to do that. But Oshio becomes convinced that they are Christian and pursues that angle. So if it hadn't been him, might this have been dealt with as a kind of just ordinary kind of charlatanry? Would there have been, it's impossible for me to say whether there was tighter surveillance in Edo than Edo and Osaka, but I imagine not. But one thing that is very interesting too about the case is the Kyoto connection, because Mitsugi is based in Kyoto and Mizuno Gunki was in Kyoto. Mizuno Gunki, in fact, served in a couple of high-ranking noble and cadet houses of the imperial family as a scribe. He was expelled from them for some kind of nefarious financial dealings. But dealing with the court or people connected in any way with the court, was very difficult for the Osaka magistrate. So in fact, the Kyoto connection does add another angle to the handling of this matter, which is interesting for what it says about the place of the court in life at that time.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm aware that we're near the end of our time. What I'd like to do is to just go back to what I promised to do, which is talk a little bit about using this book in the classroom as I turn things back over to Dr. Laffin. And one of the things that I would just say, and this is related to one of the questions we didn't get to, is that this very issue of terminology is one of the ones that my students struggle with the most in contemporary Japan, but also in the Edo period. And so I think that using a book like this that shows just how problematic many of our contemporary terms are, it sort of shows them rather than telling them that the terms are slippy and so forth. So one person in the Q&A was asking about sorcery and other words for semi-religious groups, or words like the Lord of Heaven and so forth. These are the same sorts of questions that many of my students have, like, well, what does all this mean? And I find that I am just like chomping at the bit to use this in the classroom, because it will help them see that maybe even the place where they're starting their question is not where the historical figures were starting. And so I think it's just wonderful, and I want to thank the professors again for offering this to us. So with that, I'll turn things back over to Christina Laffin to wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Julian, and thank you, Professors Miyazaki and Nakai as well. As we wrap up, I just want to remind you that you can buy this book via Columbia University Press as an ebook, or as a paperback, or as a hardcover. We'll be offering another book launch next month on October 15th with Erin Brightwell to talk about her book on Kagami Mono, which is entitled Reflecting the Past, Place, Language, and Principle in Japan's Medieval Mirror Genre. And this will take place 1 hour later at 6 p.m. Pacific time or 9 p.m. Eastern time.